I'm good. Like I said, I stopped at the truck stop just so it's coming in. So they really built that place. So good. Well, they made a real nice one. I mean, you go in there and get coffee, you get something to eat. They got a dog park. I mean, it's like, geez. I've seen a lot more of those, and really most people, everybody wants to eat at a restaurant too. They're going to stop at a nice place like that. They're just a place with a year-old candy. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day. We finally get some nice weather, and now we tell you to come inside here.
Yeah.
We're glad that you did come here tonight. Tonight we have Dr. John Ball from South Dakota State University speaking about the Emerald Ash Borer. Some of the folks in here, at least staff-wise, have seen this presentation before. We've shared a lot of this information with the City of Vermillion Tree Board, and the Tree Board and City staff decided that it would be a great opportunity if we could bring him here to speak and share what's going on with this. There's a lot of questions. When I say world renowned, it is, and he didn't smirk about it, but I challenge you to Google it, Emerald Ash Borer, and you ain't gonna get past the second page without seeing the thing. If you look Emerald Ash Borer in South Dakota, you're on the first page.
Yeah, there you go.
So, synonymous, I don't know there. And we know he didn't bring it with him.
Nope.
So that's a plus. But Dr. Ball here is going to speak a little bit tonight about a 45-hour presentation, answer questions, or have questions and answers if you need it. We have city staff here too. If citizens want to talk to Pete or myself or any of the tree board members on what we're doing or how we're hoping to address the issue, what we've done already, and what we have planned for the future with it. So this is going to be taped and rebroadcast on YouTube, and then I think on our city website is that we're going to have a link to it there. So if A, you want to see yourself on TV, or B, you want to share it with someone else, that's another avenue to do it. So with that one, if anybody doesn't know, we have restrooms right outside the hall, drinking fountains and whatnot if you need to use those. Otherwise, Dr. Ball, I'm going to turn it over to you and say thank you for coming down to Vermillion tonight, and the stage is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I was working today on Emerald Ash Borer in Sioux Falls, so finished up the day. The first warm day we've had. I mean, 80 degrees. It was actually nice to sweat for a change. And so I came down here. I'm kind of tethered. I have to stand about here, so the mic will pick it up, so I'm not going to be animated as I usually am. But I'm going to give you kind of an overview of Emerald Ash Borer, a little bit about what's going on in Sioux Falls, because that gives you a good idea of what's going to be going on here. And then a little bit what happens if you don't do anything. So I will tell you at the beginning, all my news is bad news. I have no good news tonight, all right? There is nothing there's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no end of the rainbow. It's all bad. So to begin with, we joined the club nobody wants to join, last year when we confirmed Emerald Ash Borer in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now, this map doesn't show it, but it's also been confirmed in Winnipeg. I've been up there taking a look at it. It's certainly in Nebraska. There's a little spot all the way out in Colorado, but generally speaking, we're kind of on the western end of the infestation. Most of Iowa counties have a confirmation. Only eastern Minnesota has been affected so far, though it has moved a little beyond the Twin Cities. But as you can see, just about everybody east has already been impacted. And the important thing there is it's spread out from Detroit area, Michigan, where it was first discovered in about 2001, 2002. And it had been there, they believe, maybe 5 or 7 years beforehand, but nobody knew about the insect, so they weren't really expecting it. So it moved through Michigan fairly quickly. By that, in about 20 years, it essentially covered the entire state. That's the picture that got our attention last year. It was the first weekend in May, almost a year ago, ironically, that I got this picture sent to me as a text by a tree company in Sioux Falls. They were trimming trees. Now, remember how late winter was last year, just like this year. And they weren't taking down a dying tree. They weren't taking down a dead tree. They were merely pruning trees away from buildings. Simple as that. When they made a cut, the branch tore. And when it tore, the bark slips away very easily in the spring. They found that insect. And they texted it to me, because the tree companies know if you see something unusual, text it. And it was on a Saturday, and I was working out at McCory Gardens. And I had just put away all climbing gear. It was Saturday morning, and I checked my texts, and I looked at the picture and said, "What do you think, Dr. Ball?" And I said, "I think I'll be there in an hour." So went down there. Sure enough, it was emerald ash borer. I can identify these. I did my PhD on the genus of insects, so I'm familiar with this insect. And I've looked at it in a lot of areas out east, worked with out there, and I've been to China too several times, working on it over there as well. So it was very clear it was emerald ash borer, but I can't announce that. I had to take samples of it and say I found it, and then that goes up through our state government. It goes to APHIS, it goes to Washington, D.C., and then it came back, yep, you do have emerald ash borer, and we're good to go. So, and since that time, we found it in other trees, about 300 trees so far in Sioux Falls, as well as a couple of other little areas. Well, I want to spend just a moment how to identify an infested tree. First of all, that tree is not infested. For years, anyone visiting our state that knows anything about emerald ash borer stops on the eastern end of the state and they find a half-dead tree. And they go, "Oh my goodness, they must have emerald ash borer. I found a half-dead ash tree." And they send me a picture and say, "You have emerald ash borer." And I said, "No, we have a lot of half-dead ash trees in South Dakota. Ash isn't very happy here, and it lets us know it." So merely looking at dying ash is not going to give you an indication that the tree is infested. So instead, let's take a look at some of the things you want to look at to see if the tree may have emerald ash borer. And as I always say, I'll confirm the insects in a community, such as vermilion, but you'll find it. But then you'll contact me, and then I'll come down and do the identification. There's only one of me, there's lots of you, so we really depend on people going out and looking for possible signs. So this summer, here's one of the big things to look for. If you notice an ash tree, not a half-dead ash tree, but an ash tree that part of the canopy, the leaves are smaller than normal and lighter than normal. That is one very good clue that that tree may have emerald ash borer. Since the beetle tunnels just beneath the bark, it cuts off the food being manufactured by the leaves getting down to the roots. As the roots begin to starve, they're taking up less water. As they're taking up less water, part of the canopy has leaves that are smaller and lighter than normal. So half-dead trees, not a sign of a beginning infestation. Certainly towards the end, they're half-dead and finally do die. But at the beginning, what you're going to find is a canopy that's just a little lighter than normal. What you'll also find in trees are these water sprouts, epicormic shoots we often call them, coming up along the branches. Now, that's a general indication the tree's stressed, because we find that after ice damage as well. But this and seeing suckers are also very good clues that the tree may be infested. But here again, while this tree is infested with emerald ash borer, you get a tree with a lawnmower enough and you'll get sprouts as well. Another one, though, is vertical splits in young trees and splits on branches in trees. What happens is that area of the tree has already died, and as the tree continues to expand, that bark, instead of expanding, merely tears. And so you get these long splits in them. And if you stick a penknife into that, you're going to see what I call the Superman symbol. That if you look, there's going to be galleries, tunnels made by the insect, because they're just beneath the bark, and the tunnels are going to look just like a perfect S. That's what you want to look for, S-shaped. Emerald ash borer makes nice little S shape, but there is a ash tree in Turner County that was dying, so they assumed if it's dying it is emerald ash borer. And I went and looked at it, pulled the bark away, because as I say, it was dying, and you could see all these tunnels. But notice how they're meandering? That's what our native insect will do. We do have insects in the state that have always attacked ash. They go after dying ash and essentially finish them off. But in order for it to be emerald ash borer, you want to see very clear serpentine or S-shaped galleries. It's fairly unique, and these are found just beneath the bark. Since they are found just beneath the bark, woodpeckers love them. They're tasty, apparently. All right, and that's actually been one of our best ways of finding an infested tree. I learned this when the infestation had worked its way out to Illinois. We noticed that all the infested trees had been really hit by woodpeckers. And it's very, very, very good sign that what you're looking at is that tree's attacked. And so really what you want to do, you find a tree with a little bit lighter canopy, and you look up in the upper branches, you're going to find what we call blonding, where the woodpeckers have pulled away the outer bark in their search for these insects. And you'll only find it in the upper branches to begin with, because emerald ash borer is like cats. It loves sunny spots, it likes warmth. And so it doesn't attack in the deep shade of a tree, it attacks up in the upper branches. And then as the tree begins to die, it'll attack lower and lower and lower in the canopy. But in the beginning, south side of tree, sunny side of tree, think where a cat would like to be, that's pretty much where you'll find it. And where you'll find it, you'll see the woodpeckers. Now, one real important distinction here. If you say, look up and say, oh my goodness, I'm seeing woodpecker damage. I see where it's blonding. It might not be woodpeckers. Squirrels will do that. Squirrels will pull the bark off. Now, they're not looking for emerald ash borer. We have no idea what they're doing. They're squirrels. They do what squirrels do. But this particular tree, I got the call. They said, it must be of emerald ash borer. It's kind of a dying tree. Okay. It has blonding. Okay. But when I got out there, I found 10 bird feeders on that tree. And I said, do you have any squirrels? He says, oh yeah, I count 22. I feed them too. So what you really need to look for are woodpecker pecks in the blonding. Do you see that where it looks like somebody stuck a Phillips screwdriver head into it? If you see that, that's woodpeckers. You see a tree that's declining a little bit, blonding near the top, looks like someone stuck a Phillips screwdriver in it through that blonding. I want to know about that tree, because most likely that's an infested tree. And what's interesting, everywhere you find a peck, if you pull the bark away, a tunnel stops right there. They are spot on. They listen for them, and when they find them, get the bark, kill them, and eat them. Now, you might say, well, woodpeckers will take care of the whole problem then. No, emerald ash borer has about 80 eggs. Woodpeckers don't have 80 eggs, all right? They're not going to be able to keep up. But what they do is tell us which tree's infested. Now, after the tree's been infested for several years, you'll get a tree that looks like that. And that's over in Minnesota, not in South Dakota. But that tree's been infested for about 4 years, and they stripped all the bark off it, and the bark is piled on the bottom. That's a tree I don't want to find in Vermilion, because that means that tree's been infested for about 5 years and everybody's missed it. And that probably means there's other infested trees. The last one of the 6 is finding D-shaped holes. Now, the insect comes out of these little D-shaped holes, but you're not likely to see those because, remember, they start attacking the tops of the trees. By the time they're about our height, that tree is just about dead. And so by then it's pretty obvious that it was infested because you'll find all the woodpecker damage. But nevertheless, D-shaped holes. Now, it has to be a very distinct D. Our native insects will make kind of an oval-shaped hole. So if you have to think about whether it's a D or not, it's not. And remember, you're not likely to see these on a tree that's lightly infested unless you're up in the canopy. The beetle itself should be flying here in another few weeks. In South Dakota, the flight periods between our bookends for summer, between Memorial Day and Labor Day. They begin flying about when black locusts are in bloom. And then about the end of June, when little leaf lindens are in bloom, that's when we get the peak emergence. The adults live for about 3 weeks. The last one emerges sometime in early August, and so by Labor Day, it's already died. So the summer is when they're actually out flying. The rest of the year, they're snug within the tree. Now, the emerald ash borer itself, you're not likely to see. South side of a tree, midday, sunny day, think of cats again, you might see one. but otherwise are flying fairly high above you. Close relatives are this. This is one of our native borers. It attacks dying trees. Notice it's a little wider. They're both about a ½ inch long, but it's a little wider, and it's speckled, so that's not emerald ash borer. But what amazes me in Sioux Falls, the insect that was most often submitted to me as emerald ash borer was not this, but this. I was amazed. Everybody found a cicada on their tree. And if they found a cicada, they called me up and said, our tree's infested, I found them. My absolute favorite were people that called up and said, you know, I stood outside last night and I could hear them buzzing in my trees. You ought to set off your air conditioner more often and stand outside, because they've been buzzing out there your entire life. All right, those are cicadas, but I was surprised that people were confusing them. So a little bit on the life cycle again. The adults are flying end of May or early June till about the beginning of September. Again, Labor Day is a pretty good window. The adults are laying their eggs during the summer. The eggs are hatching, and then the larvae, that little worm stage, is feeding through the summer into the fall. And in South Dakota right now, they continue feeding into the spring. But late spring, May, essentially, and this is what we're seeing in Sioux Falls, they have formed their little pupae, call it their resting stage, the cocoon stage, as most people think of, and they're getting ready to emerge here in a few more weeks. An important thing here, though, is why they go through the life cycle generally in a year, though in some cases it does take 2 years. In other words, they stay in that worm stage for an entire year. It usually takes 4 or 5 years of repeated attacks to kill a tree. It's not like mountain pine beetle, which a lot of people in the state are familiar with, and they may recall that I would tell them if you lived out in the hills, you had to spray your pines, because if you didn't, if they were attacked, they were killed. Well, emerald ash borer, it takes a while, all right? It takes 4 or 5 years of attack to finally finish it off. However, they will finish it off, and here's an important number there. Notice the 10-year survival rate of ash. What's that number? It's 0, right? It's an important number because a lot of people are in denial. When I talk to communities, some communities say, well, it's not going to hit our community. There's nothing different about any community yet I found in Sioux Falls that means the emerald ash borer isn't going to like it. People say it was going to get too cold here. It's not cold enough. You know, all sorts of excuses. Or I like it, my ash are going to be tougher. No, your ash are just the same as every other ash. Frankly, you're going to lose every ash tree in this town once emerald ash borer arrives. In Sioux Falls, that's 85,000 trees. That's a lot of trees they're going to lose. That's about 1/3 of the community forest. And the point is, you will lose them all. If you say, well, John, I don't have a green ash, I have a Patmore ash. That's a green ash. Well, I have a summit ash. That's a green ash. Just about every ash you have is a green ash. Every ash growing along the river system here is a green ash. We do have some white ash planted. They die almost as fast. Occasionally there is a tree that survives, but it's relatively rare. If you still have a black ash, you're going to lose all those. So the point of this is, from the day we detect emerald ash borer in Vermilion, you can just about start the clock, and 10 years later, every untreated ash will be dead. Now, there's one little important point I want to make here. Last week I was in Michigan, right near Ground Zero, and the forests there are covered with these small diameter ash, little ones, and they're being attacked. But they get big enough that they produce seed. And so what you're going to find in Vermilion for the rest of your life are little ash trees coming up. Just get big enough to produce seed, and then they're attacked and they start to decline. So some people say, well, John, once the emerald ash borer kills all our ash trees, it'll also die and we can plant ash back again. No. When I say it's going to kill all your ash trees, it's going to kill all your mature ash trees. You're always going to get seedlings and saplings coming up. So you're always going to have enough emerald ash borers flying around here that they're going to find any tree you plant or any tree you quit treating and kill that as well. So like I say, there is no good news tonight. Well, what kills them? We know they're going to kill every ash tree. What kills them? Well, first of all, woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are pretty good at it. Notice here they can kill about 30 to 40% of the insects in a tree. I mean, it does help. I like woodpeckers. All right, anything kills some of them, anything reduce population, I'm fine with. They not only tell us what trees are infested, they're very good at that. all right, kind of like pointers. I mean, it's right there. Okay, fine, thank you. But they find the darn things and will eat them. So they're pretty good. And they're doing a great job up in Sioux Falls. In Sioux Falls, we also release natural enemies. These are insects from China that feed on emerald ash borer. They're what we call parasitoids. The wasp, the non-stinging wasp, by that I mean it doesn't sting people, what it does is it inserts a little what we call an ovipositor into an emerald ash borer egg or into an emerald ash borer larvae. The eggs then hatch and they feed on the insect. If you ever remember the movie Aliens, the first one, it's kind of like that. All right, they're going to pump eggs in it, they're going to feed from the inside, and then they're going to come out of the body. Kind of a horrible way to die, but who cares? It's an emerald ash borer. All right, and so we've been releasing those. But I had people in Sioux Falls, through APHIS, I've had people in Sioux Falls say, oh my goodness, we don't need to treat our trees. This will kill them all. No, it won't. Look at that. It'll kill about 20%. And the important thing there is, when I'm over in China, when they plant our native ash trees, and they don't really do that anymore, but when they plant our native ash trees, which they call garden ash, those trees are relatively quickly killed by emerald ash borer. They have all the natural enemies there, right? The problem with our trees is our trees really don't have resistance to this insect. They're not able to turn on defenses to actually fought off the attack. Remember, our native ash insects, what do they go after? Dying ash that really don't have the defenses. With emerald ash borer, the problem is emerald ash borer arrived this country, recognized our ash trees as ash trees, so suitable hosts. Our ash trees' defenses didn't turn on to help stop that attack. So it doesn't matter whether they're healthy or dying or what, they're generally attacked and killed. So why releasing these will help a little bit. Again, the point is they're not going to be a big help. Anything to slow it, I'm for. We did have to tell people, you know, these are non-stinging wasps. You can see the size of them. They're not very frightening. But I had people in Sioux Falls send me pictures of yellow jackets in their garage and say, I think I found one of your non-stinging wasps. And I say, no, that's not one of ours. Get away from it. All right, but we are releasing these in Sioux Falls, and again, they are going to be of some help. The other thing which every South Dakotan really was hoping for was the winter cold enough. You know, in South Dakota, we pride ourselves. We have a real cold winter. That ought to get rid of relatives we don't want and everything else. And it does help with insects, and it certainly helps with relatives, but not enough with emerald ash borer. This is under scientific tests. You can lose about 5% at 0 degrees. And I mean, it has to be 0 for a while because that temperature has to get beneath the bark. You can kill 99% at minus 30. And some of you think, well, it got to minus 27, but how long was it at minus 27? You know, it wasn't long enough. And yes, we did lose a lot this winter. Some of them look like kind of the black bananas that have sat in the freezer, but there's a very healthy one that I pulled out as well. So when we did our survey in Sioux Falls, we actually killed quite a few up in the canopies. Why? Very thin bark, very easily exposed to the cold. But we didn't kill very many in the trunks. Why? Thicker bark. So our estimate, and it's really an estimate, is we killed about 30%. Now that's good, and if you add all these up, 30 to 40%, 20%, maybe 30%, you say, boy, we might have killed 90% of them. But remember, every female emerald ash borer can lay about 80 eggs. So the population just keeps building and building and building. So we have emerald ash borer in Sioux Falls. So first figure out how long it's been there, and we did that. I'll show you that next picture. And then treat the trees you want to save. Remove the trees you don't want. Remove trees that are infested. And if you do nothing, you're going to have dead trees falling. This is the chart, and I've got the references down below this because this came from papers, of what we call the death curve. And it's kind of a generic death curve, but it illustrates the point here. And that is, if you take a look at the line of tree mortality, the blue line there, it always trails the population of EAB. And we're there at about 300 trees, about year 3. This year would be year 4. That's when we look back, that's how long it's been in Sioux Falls. And as I say, it had been there at least 2 or 3 years. There was an occasional, we found 1 or 2 trees that we believe have been infested for 4 years. But nevertheless, a relatively young infestation of about 300 trees. Now, if Sioux Falls did nothing, they could coast for about another 4 years. And you wouldn't see that much mortality yet. You know, to lose 10,000 trees in a city of that size, it's not really going to make much of an impact. And some communities out east did that. They took down a few trees. They said, well, gee, everything looks fine and fine and fine. And then take a look between years 7 and 10. Lose 61,000 trees. They will certainly notice that. That's a lot of trees lost over a very short time. Nobody has the resources to cut down that many trees in that short of a time period. And as I mentioned earlier, if you don't cut them down, they fall down. They become very, very hazardous. And so what Sioux Falls is doing is preemptive. They're going out there and starting to remove healthy ash trees right now. The idea is they're not going to stop it. There is nothing you're going to do other than treating that's going to stop it. But the idea is, can we spread the costs over a longer time period so we don't overcome city resources? There's been several communities that have thought in those first few years, oh, it's not going to be that bad here. We're okay. Things are going just smooth. Oh, we're losing some trees. We're cutting them down, but it's not that bad. And then suddenly everything starts dying. And then they call and say, the trees are starting to fall in the street. What do we do? Well, you're too late then. So getting ahead of it's better than staying behind it. What about treating trees? In Sioux Falls last summer, I announced at our meetings, okay, everybody, emerald ash borer's here. Now your ash are like your children. Pick your favorites. All right? The ones you like, you're going to treat. The ones you don't like, you might as well get rid of them. Move them out of the basement. They're not staying home anymore. All right? Because if you're not going to treat the ash, you are going to lose it. It's an absolute guarantee. It's not you are going to have the ash that survives. And I didn't say you had to remove it today, but you know what? Why not plant it? A good example, after I looked at the insect there, found it, identified it, I went home, we have one ash in our patio. And when we had coffee the next morning on a Sunday morning, I told Doreen, I said, you know what? When the emerald ash borer works its way up to Brookings, which we haven't confirmed it yet, of course, I said, I'll start treating that tree. And she looked out the window and she said, you know, really, I'd like a larger deck. So by Sunday afternoon, I took care of the emerald ash borer problem in my yard. I cut down the only ash tree. We're building a bigger deck. All right? So again, in Vermilion right now, you do not need to treat. You don't treat until we confirm it here. But right now is a good time to start making those decisions. What ash trees do you have that you like? Well, those you might say, you know what, we'll treat those when the time comes. Trees you say, I have no interest in keeping, it's cheaper to start removing them now than later. Treatments are very effective, but I tell people there are trees that should not be treated. Trees that are already decayed and rotting. Why invest money in trees that are just going to fall apart? Trees that have hollows in them. Trees that are pretty much dead. We don't need to treat those. And a lot of communities, such as Sioux Falls, is saying that you're going to treat all the trees by injection. All right, it has to be individual trees. I was asked today in Sioux Falls, is there anything that we can just spray over the city to kill them? Those days are long since gone. Anyone remembers the old days of mosquito spraying and that, where we'd fog the entire community? Most people aren't really going to welcome a pesticide like this being sprayed over the entire town. It's not going to happen. Plus, the amount we'd have to spray to get through the canopy, you're not going to be happy with it. So the best way to treat this is put the chemical in the tree. That minimizes the damage, right? We're putting it in the tree. The cost. This gives you an idea currently in Sioux Falls. If you take the diameter of your tree, not the circumference, but the diameter, at about chest level, take that, multiply it by 10. That's going to be your price. And again, that's today's dollars in Sioux Falls. And it's a rough estimate that if you have a lot of trees, for example, there's some areas where they've said, let's get the whole neighborhood together and get one contract out. You can get your price down to about 7 because it makes sense. An applicator can say, I can go from this tree to this tree to this tree. We also have people that say, well, you know what, I'm treating my tree and I don't have any neighbors that are treating it. Well, now an applicator's got to drive over to treat just that one tree, so your price is going to be higher. I've seen some people charge as much as 14 and people willing to pay it. Why? Because it's a person they trust and they've worked with. Makes sense. I haven't seen much below 7. and I'll get nervous if it goes much below 7 because you've got to make sure you've got sufficient chemical in the tree. Right now, we're asking the applicators to put the medium rate in. I'm also telling homeowners that once the infestation starts building in Sioux Falls, that'll change to the high rate, which means that they're going to have to put a little bit more chemical into it, so it's probably going to cost you a little bit more. And notice you got to repeat it every other year. I've told everybody once you start treating, and you do not treat until we confirm it, okay, you're going to treat it 5 times. Absolutely. Don't even start unless you're going to do it 5 times, 2 years apart, all right, with our current chemicals. Things do change, so who knows. And then after that, you're going to do it about every 3 or 4 years. And theoretically, that would go indefinitely. So I always look at the next 20 years cost. You're probably going to treat that tree about 8 times over the next 20 years. And is that cost worth it? That's a personal judgment, of course. But what I don't want to see, and we see this in other communities out east, where people have what we call injection fatigue. They do it for 3 times, 6 years, and then they say, you know what, I'm tired of spending the money. And you know what happens? Then the tree's attacked and killed. So, you know, really make hard cases there. Treatment windows just getting started in Sioux Falls here in about another week when the tree leaves out, and usually ends about mid-August, but there are some chemicals that can be injected later in the year. But essentially it's a summertime. You get the chemical in the tree, it's taken up through the leaves. The adults have to feed on the leaves before they lay eggs, so you're going to kill some adults. And then when the egg hatches and the larvae feed beneath the bark of the tree, you're going to kill larvae as well. And the chemical's effective for at least 2 years, and that's why we say every other year. When we looked at costs, when people had bids for removing the tree, and they also got a bid for pruning or for treating the tree, and I took all those bids, about 280 bids, is that when you looked at a 20-inch diameter tree and larger, that was a healthy tree, it made sense to treat it. Absolute good sense for a homeowner to treat it. Why? Because it takes about 20 years for those costs to even out. In other words, the cost of removal now is about the same of treating it over the next 20 years. And so for a lot of homeowners, and particularly homeowners my age, where I've got about a 20-year window that I'm looking at, beyond that is really not critical to me. I'm probably going to live to be able to get all my Social Security, for example. It's going to be somebody else's problem. Old age has a plus, all right? Then I'm good. And I think 20 years is reasonable. Many cities do not treat trees, and for a very good reason. Cities go on forever. Homeowners tend to pass away or move or such. And cities don't want to inherit that cost indefinitely. Some cities treat some trees. Some cities decided they don't want to treat any. But for homeowners, above 20 inches, it makes absolute sense if it's a healthy tree. Less than 10 inches, that better be a real important tree here because the cost of removal is minuscule. And remember, now you're in treatment costs for at least 20 years and beyond. So below 10 inches, to me, and again, unless there's some real strong value to that tree, and you expect to live in that house a long time, I would remove it. Between 10 and 20, it's a judgment call. But I'll also give you this as a point. I have seen it in Sioux Falls already, is that you want to sell your home. And some of you remember this with Dutch elm disease. You had to say there was an elm tree in your yard. Oh, you've got a big ash tree in your yard. Well, they know that ash tree is going to die or they're going to have to treat it. And we have seen where people have said, condition of sale is you remove the ash tree because they don't want that cost. Because it's a cost, right? Just like anybody else would look at buying a home, you might say, you know what, you got to fix the porch steps. You've got to do something else. So sometimes people have just said, I don't even want to think of that problem afterwards. I don't care about treatments. I just want it gone. So consider that as well. Also, make sure the company knows how to inject trees properly. We have seen cases where some of the companies, and I will say it's a very small minority, have not treated trees properly, don't treat trees that are dead. The other thing I would strongly encourage is that you be careful what trees you're treating. My favorite was a homeowner that got a guarantee that their trees would not die of emerald ash borer. It was a lock solid guarantee because the trees were not ash. All right, so make sure that you have an ash tree in your yard that's being treated and make sure it's being treated properly. And one of the things that Sioux Falls is doing that I really like, and in fact, quite honestly, I like everything they're doing, is you have to be licensed to treat in that town. Now, everyone has to be a certified applicator, but they're licensed by the city as well. So you saw that, yes, I'm an applicator for the state, and then you get your little license there, and you have to put a tag on every tree that you treat, and you have to GPS it and send it to them. And I'm going to be back and doing spot checks to make sure that I find the right amount of chemical in those trees. A spot check, not checking every tree. And if we find applicators that are not doing things properly, they can pull their license. And I like that, because out with mountain pine beetle, we had companies that were doing a very poor job, and there was no way we could stop them. All right, so this way, why not, if you're not going to do it right, we don't want you to do it at all, because all the good applicators don't want that bad press of someone saying, well, I had my tree treated for 6 years and it still died. Well, it died because it wasn't being done properly. Again, it's a very, 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 very small problem, so I don't want to make it sound like it's every applicator. It's like most things. Most people are doing an honest, fair, and good job. But you're always going to get somebody that's going to bend it, and the number of applicators just skyrocketed the minute emerald ash borer rocked. The other thing Sioux Falls is doing is getting ahead of it. They're doing tree removals. Ash tree removals, of course. And I recommend that for all Sioux Falls, all South Dakota communities now. If they haven't started already, now's a good time to get started. You are going to lose your ash trees. I mean, the clock started now. And they're out there doing a good job. They're thinning the herd. They're not going down a block and removing every ash tree. They're going down a block and removing a third of the ash trees. And then they're going to come back later and go on it. And they're moving throughout the city in a random way. And then they're also planting. And the beauty of that is, if you wait until they all die and you're removing a whole bunch of trees at once, and that means you're going to plant all at once, and if you have the money to do all that, you're going to be left with a considerable gap in your canopy, aren't you? They start now and keep doing that over 5, 10 years. They've spread those costs out. They've reduced the visual impact of it. There's no disadvantage to going out and removing trees now. Again, is that going to save you from emerald ash borer? Absolutely not. It's still going to go through the community just as fast. Possibly even a little bit faster. Depends on how you remove them. But they're doing a very good job of going out there because they just can't handle the cost of going out there and removing all those trees at one time. Other thing is removal of infested trees. They do have trees that are up in the one area community where they're taking them, and they're taking those down, the ones that are not being treated. An important thing to point out is you might say, well, John, if you tell us to wait until you found it, you already said when you find it, it's already established. It might already be in my tree, but yes, it'll only been in your tree a year or two, and you know what? You can treat it and bring that tree back. We don't want you to wait until your tree's infested because people tend to dally too much, but don't be premature. We get people in the state now, so well, I'm going to start treating now just in case. It's not a good idea for your pocketbook or the tree. Wait until we find it. You might have one of those trees we found it in, but it'll probably only been in that tree for a year or two. You can treat that tree and still bring it back. The wood has to be destroyed or chipped. The biggest problem all communities are faced is, what are you going to do with all those chips? What are you going to do with all those trees you cut down? They're like zucchinis at the end of the summer. Nobody wants them anymore. And so you need to have a plan of what are you going to do with every tree that you cut down and chips. You're not going to be able to give it away to any other community. You know, in Sioux Falls, they're lucky they have the biofuel plant, and they'll take it all. But every community now has to have a plan of how they're going to dispose of all those trees. And what are you going to do with all the chips? You're either going to make them very small, all right, so that the insect can't survive, or you're going to need to find a way to destroy those as well. That's one of the things they learned in other communities. The larger chips, they will survive in it. You can spread it that way. Sioux Falls, there's already a quarantine. It's all Minnehaha County, the northeastern part of Turner County, the northern part of Lincoln County. The reason they've done that, of course, is the city crosses the boundaries of that, so we have a larger quarantine. Right now, the insect's only been found in Minnehaha County. That's why you're allowed to make a partial quarantine in the other two counties. Once we find it in Turner County, anywhere in Turner County, the entire county is quarantined. All right, I get people now calling me, well, how come you can draw a line across at a state highway and say, one side of the road's quarantined, the other side's not? You gotta draw a line somewhere, people. It's better that than in the middle of a cornfield, nobody can figure it out. Right now, if you live in Minnehaha County, you can't move ash wood out of there. You can't move it as logs, chips, branches, anything other than a bedroom set. You can't move it because nobody else in the state wants it. The other problem, I don't want anyone driving out of Sioux Falls, because even if you stop all the wood movement, what I find interesting is you're going to find a few hitchhikers. Everybody here has got in their car or their truck out in the middle of a pasture and found a grasshopper on the windshield. And you pull out on the highway and you're driving along and you're thinking, how fast can I go before that woodpecker peels? Oh, come on, yeah, everybody does it. 40, 50, 60, 80 miles an hour, whatever, okay. And it finally tumbles off. Somebody in Michigan actually did a study and found that they light on cars and tumble off. And so we also saw that they follow transportation corridors. So even if we said no movement of wood, and that's hard to do. Somebody always moves something even though they're not supposed to. One of the things you're going to have is that someone up in Sioux Falls has a boat, a couple of them land in a boat. Put a boat cover on, drive it down here, hold the boat cover away, and a couple get out. Now, is that a major way? No, but it is a possible way. So it's more than just firewood. Well, let's say you do nothing. Now you have the hazards of the infested trees. They fall. These are not like cottonwoods and elms that stand forever. We've got dead cottonwoods up in Brookings County I've used as a marker for 20 years. There's some elms that I look at. They've been standing dead for a decade. That's not going to happen with emerald ash borer infested trees. They tend to fall, and people tend to wait too long. This is not a pretty picture. That's not in Sioux Falls. That's a community out east that I visited last week. Every tree you look at is a standing dead ash tree that died from being infested by emerald ash borer. When that happens, you now have trees that are very tricky to remove and they're unpredictable. They can stand for several years. They can fall tomorrow. You don't want that in your backyards. Plus, the cost of removing those trees goes up considerably because it's a lot of risk. The other thing with those trees, these are standing dead trees. Notice every branch is still on them. They tend to hold their branches. Not every one of them, so things fall off. But then when they fall, they shatter. And debris goes everywhere. Plus, they're unusual trees. The best way to describe them, and when I was out east, this is the way they described them, it's like cutting a tree made out of styrofoam. Think of the consistency of that. You actually go through a lot more bar oil when you're cutting too, and the saw junk gams up. But how would you like to cut down a tree made out of styrofoam? It's not going to fall very easily. Finally, they do fall. They can fall like that picture from Michigan here, where a large dead tree has fallen across the road. That was accompanied in an article where they were discussing 14 people that had been killed from falling ash trees over time. You get them like the larger picture there that I show. There was a tree that just fell. But you also get these. They just split, kind of like a baseball bat. Doesn't it look like that? You hit a baseball to it and it just splits along the long arm there. Ash tends to do that. So they're just going to end up splitting like that. These are trees you cannot wait. These are trees that once they're dead, it's really the costs go up for removal. These are why I say pick your favorites, the trees you want to treat, and start making a list of the trees you don't, and start planning on getting them out of there in the next couple of years. The other thing is quit planting maple. In Sioux Falls, a third of their trees are maple. You know, we're not learning our lessons. When the elm started to die, everybody planted ash. Now the ash are going, everybody's planting maple. Autumn blaze maple's a pretty tree. It's on my naughty list. Don't plant it anymore. The reason being is we got way too many out there. And I worry about some insect coming over from China. We already have the Asian longhorn beetle. It's not here in South Dakota, but it is out east, and it loves maple. Country with most species of maple is China. Most likely something's going to show up from over there sooner or later. And I don't want to have somebody standing here 20 or 30 years from now saying, you know what, we lost all the elms, we planted ash. We lost all the ash, we planted maple. Now we're losing all the maples. When people ask me now, what should I plant? My best advice is look what your neighbors have planted and plant something else. The other thing, too, is we're going to lose a lot of shelter belts out there. We've got about 55,000 miles of shelter belts, and that's 15% of the trees. About 2.5 million trees, and we're going to lose those as well. Now, you might want to know, well, when's it going to arrive here in Vermilion? And I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I got a good guess. And I'm basing that guess on how long it took Dutch elm disease to arrive here. Now, Dutch elm disease is a fungus, not an insect, but it's moved by an insect. And it was moved by firewood. Some of you remember that. You couldn't have firewood inside the communities during the heydays. And so the transportation's about the same. So let's take a look at the state. Now, ironically, what was the first place we found Dutch elm disease in the state? It was Sioux Falls. All bad things start there. All right, that's kind of the heart here. Anything bad's going to show up in Sioux Falls, and that was first confirmed in 1969. All right, and I have the records county by county. By 1973, so we're talking 4 or 5 years, it had spread that far. So think of that. We confirmed it, EAB, in Sioux Falls in 2018. I'll be very surprised if it's not here by 2022. And 2022 is not that far away, is it, when you start thinking about it? I mean, you've got about 3 years or so to start doing things. I could be wrong. This is based on a fungus disease, but since it moves on firewood, I think it's a pretty reasonable estimate. And by the way, that doesn't mean it's going to be to 2022. I said by that time. Here, you could see it this year. You could see it next year. But my point is, you're not going to be waiting that long to see it. It's not going to be, well, 20 years from now it may show up here. I am positive of that. I'll bet my paycheck on that one. Well, where else did it show up? By 1978, almost 10 years, it was all the way up Brown County, all the way across over to Millette and that. And by the way, it also showed up in the hills at about the same time. Why? People carrying firewood. By 1985, it had spread the rest, and the last county was Harding County, 1986. Now, if you live in Harding County, if you're up in Buffalo right now, you need to start worrying about it, but I'll probably be dead by then, so it's not going to be high on my list of worries. But nevertheless, even they need to be concerned, but everybody in Southeastern absolutely needs to be concerned. I'm working with the folks up in Aberdeen. Aaron Keyes, our city forester, is certainly on top of this and is working hard. He knows he's got less than 10 years. He's got an inventory. He knows how many ash he has. He's gearing up to manage it. They're removing trees. It is going to happen. He's got a little bit more time. You're probably going to have less time. And again, it will arrive here, and it will kill all your untreated ash. Statewide, we've got about 1 million ash trees in our communities. And then we've got about, as I say, about 2.5 million in our windbreaks. And look at this, 29 million along all our rivers and streams. That's going to be a problem nobody's really thought about. What are we going to do when these trees start falling in our rivers? You know, think of the log jams we're going to have. And nobody's really going to be managing that. I put the slide up here because I always get people that say, well, this is the state's responsibility. It's not. The state should do something. It's doing quite a bit. The state should pay to remove my tree. Probably not going to happen. They've got a lot of bigger resources to deal with, and I'm afraid in most communities it's going to be like every homeowner deals with, it's going to be your problem. You know, I had a homeowner call me, and I remember this during Dutch elm disease, that said, you know, it's $1,500 to remove my ash tree, which is actually a fairly cheap bid for a large tree in a backyard. I don't have the money. Will the state help me? I said, you know what? My furnace went out. It cost me $9,000 to rebuild everything. The state didn't give me a dime. As much as I hate to say it, it's probably going to end up being a individual homeowner's responsibility, because where do you stop writing checks? You know, it's going to be a big one. Cities are doing different things. City of Sioux Falls is saying street trees, they're going to pay for those removals. If a homeowner wants to treat them, they can treat them, but the minute they quit treating them, then it's up for the removal block. They're going to grind the stumps out. But, you know, it varies around the state. But the biggest thing is it's going to cost a lot of money. And the more we stretch out that time in which we have to spend that money, the better. So with that, you know, I wanted to do a presentation about 45 minutes, which I did. As I promised you in the beginning, there is no good news from what I've given you tonight. I wish I could tell you that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There is no light. The tunnel just gets really, really dark. So again, thanks for coming here this evening. Thanks for watching, those that may have watched the whole 45 minutes or so. But again, now's the time to, if you haven't started planting as individuals, now's the time to plant and think of those trees. So I'll entertain questions right now. Yes, sir.
Dr. Well, you mentioned the injection is the #1 choice for treatment. What would be number 2?
All right. His question was, I mentioned the #1 choice of taking care of the tree is injection. Another treatment that can be done is you can do a bark spray, a basal bark spray. And by basal, the lower 6 feet. It has to be done annually. It still requires a commercial applicator. And it can't be done on trees that are about more than 16 inches in diameter. So it's for smaller trees. But that is an option.
So there is, if the tree is big, there is no other option.
If a tree is large, more than 15, 16 inches, really the only good option is injecting into the trunk. There are some products that can be injected into the soil, but they have some limitations in large trees. Really, once the tree gets large, more than 15 inches, the only way you're going to effectively treat that tree at this time is to have a commercial applicator inject a chemical into the trunk.
Is it feasible for a homeowner to buy that equipment and to inject that trunk?
Question was, is it feasible for the homeowner to buy it? No. For 2 reasons. One, some of the equipment's very expensive. By very expensive, some of the injection equipment will cost you $2,500 to $4,000. Now, you might say, my gosh, that's a lot of money, but those inject very quickly. So if you're a company and saying, I plan on injecting hundreds of trees, it's certainly worth the cost. The injection equipment that is essentially free, you just put a capsule into the tree, those take longer to be absorbed, like 45 minutes in some cases. The challenge for you is those chemicals still require a commercial applicator. So if you're a private applicator, there are chemicals that you can buy that you can drill holes in the tree and inject chemicals into them that are effective. I will say, though, we really don't have anything you can go to the hardware store and buy that's effective on large trees. There's products out that say, we'll manage emerald ash borer, we'll control emerald ash borer. You pour them around the base and such. They'll work, but only on small trees. But what I already tell you with small trees, why keep them? And that.
So you also mentioned that there are some reliable, honest applicators out there. Do you have a handout that says, this is the chemical they should be using, this is the percentage that should be put in there, that sort of thing, so that those of us who want to save a tree, we can honestly believe that this guy is going to get the job done?
Right, and I'll repeat your question, but I'll phrase it slightly different. I said the vast majority are good, honest applicators. There's always just a few. And so, like anything else, you want to be a good consumer. First of all, up on the SDSU website and on beatthebeetles.com, which is done by the state, we do have the recommendations for treatment, including the basal trunk spray, which some people do on smaller trees, and the chemicals that are registered in the state of South Dakota to be used for injecting. So we have that information out there because there's more than one chemical that can be used, and there's more than one delivery system, and they're all effective. So we list the ones that are effective and are legal to use in the state, and they also have the rates and down there. So the applicator should provide you that information, what they're using, how they're doing it, what rate they're following. And again, the applicators, by and large, are being very upfront. Here's the system we're using. And I do want to point out there's more than one system. There's Arbor Jet, Arbor System, Rainbow Q-Clips. I mean, there's a lot. I'm just naming 3. So it's kind of like, I would say most importantly is, who do you really think's doing a good job for you and your trees?
How do you know that?
Well, again, that's just as a good consumer talking with someone, are they knowledgeable? Can they identify that your tree's an ash? There's this first starter. They can't identify an ash tree. I'd walk away really fast. Do they understand the biology of emerald ash borer? Can they describe it, just as I've explained to you tonight? Are they familiar with it? Do they understand the system? How long have they been doing it? Are they already established in the community? What we found with mountain pine beetle is there were companies out there that had actually been spraying for the last epidemic. Well, let's face it, if they'd been out there treating it in the 70s and they were established in the community, you're probably getting it done right. Now, I'm not saying every new company is going to do a poor job, not at all, but, you know, are they in the community? You know, there's now companies coming in. Some of those are very good, but again, I always like to give business to local companies that have been here because they're going to be here in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And again, I do want to point out the chemistry we had 15 years ago is not the chemistry we have now, and hopefully it'll improve in the next 15. So I'm giving you the worst case. You're going to do it every other year for 5 times, then you're probably going to do it 3 times at least in the next 10 years. Beyond that, my crystal ball doesn't go any farther. Yes, sir.
When it hits Vermillion, our city folks are kind of on the lookout, they be the ones to blow the horn?
Well, at this point, I'll answer your question, then I'll let the city folks chime in. The question was, when we find it in Sioux Falls, or excuse me, in Vermillion, are they going to make the announcement and such? At this point, this is still a regulated insect, so the way it would work is someone calls, I take a look at it, I put my best poker face on, take it back, I say, look, I found it here, take pictures of it, send it. The most likely is still the state would make the announcement that we now have a new infestation in town here. And that will probably change over time as more and more communities get infested, but right now we're watching over that. Obviously, the city officials would be first to be told, so they don't hear it on the radio. But nevertheless, probably the announcement would come from the state forester or from APHIS, which is also, again, the federal agencies in charge of it. Anything from the city's perspective on that?
I think you're right on there. We're not going to go in someone's backyard and take down a tree. That's not what we do. But if it is in a street tree, or if we have a homeowner who takes a tree down in their backyard, if they suspect something, they can always call the city. We have our tree specialists go out, take a look at it, and then from there we'd probably be in contact with you, and we might have a possible candidate.
And the way you described is the way I like it the best. Somebody calls you, which I always like, you have your person go out and look, and if they think it's a possibility, then they call me. And so essentially that's the first filter. You know, right now in Sioux Falls we say don't even bother to call, just treat your tree if you want to keep it. We are still looking for it around the community, of course, but I like that approach. We're going to look. If you call us, we'll come out. We're the same thing. We do not go into backyards or without permission, of course. People in South Dakota are usually pretty friendly letting you if you ask. All right. By the way, there's no prize for being the first. I've literally had some people call me and say, I'm pretty sure I have emerald ash borer. My first comment to them is, that must hurt. And they hesitate for a second. Oh no, my tree. Okay, good. Your tree has emerald ash borer. But then they say, well, I say, well, you know what, we can take a look, you know, send me a picture and that. And said, okay, but I get to announce it. There's no prize, people, all right? There's none of this that, you know, you don't want to be the person to announce it. All your neighbors will hate you, so to speak. You brought it. That's all they'll say. Let us be the bad people. We're government. We always get dumped on. Yes, sir.
Does anybody know what percentage of trees in Vermillion are ash trees?
Good question.
We have a study from 2013 that stated that, and in the boulevards, we'll look at percentage-wise, I don't know, but I believe the number is about 550 to 600.
Okay.
That's the street boulevard trees, that does not go into the private sector.
So the question was how many ash trees are in town here, and the answer was about 600 street trees. That doesn't include park trees, or does it?
No, I do have a second list of park
Okay.
trees.
So about 600 street trees, doesn't include park trees, doesn't include trees on campus, doesn't include trees in backyards. The usual rule of thumb I've used from inventories, you take what you find for street trees, you multiply it by 4, and that's probably all the ash trees you have. So most likely you're probably sitting somewhere between the 2,000 and 3,000 for ash trees in the community. And that's just a guess. Yes, sir.
How long was it in Sioux Falls before it was identified?
About 3 years, I think. You know, that's why I always say we haven't confirmed it yet. I don't like to say it's not here, because it certainly had been there for several years without us knowing about it. But I mean, that's how stealth it can be. The good thing for Sioux Falls, and as I say, they've done a tremendous amount right. It was caught fairly early. And that's why it's important for every community to kind of look for it. And we do get a lot of false positives. People go out and say, well, I think I found it in that. They send you a picture and you say, you know what, that might be. You go out and look at it, you don't see the woodpecker pecks in that. Or in one case, we found the woodpecker pecks, but it was actually woodpeckers after something else. Occasionally that does happen. And they say, well, we're sorry about that. No, 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 I'm fine with that. Because, you know, let's say if we find it in Vermilion, I'd rather find it in Vermilion when it's only infested 30 or 40 trees than say, oh, we found it and there's 3,000 trees infested. Game's over. So staying alert to it's important too. Yes, sir.
You mentioned to not plant maple.
Yes.
What would you have as a plant?
All right. Now again, the question was, I said not to plant maple. Yes. Now, if you have a community where there isn't a lot of maple, sure, go ahead. But Sioux Falls right now, a third of their trees are maple. So it's already too many. Again, my advice is look what your neighbors have planted and plant something else. And the other thing is I would say shame on all you, whatever you call people from Vermilion, Vermilionites, whatever. All right, so all you Vermilionites, you live in the banana belt of South Dakota. You can grow everything. So why not take advantage of that? I mean, I'll tell you some of my favorites, and I'll hate them if everybody just goes out and plants them all. But yellowwood is one of my favorite trees. And it does wonderful here. It's a beautiful tree, bluish-gray bark, beautiful hanging white flowers at the end of May that are fragrant, good yellow fall color, but it's a tree rarely used. And I like that. If it's rarely used, that's a tree we're probably not going to see a lot of problems with. Kentucky coffee trees, one of my favorites. They're actually native down here, despite the name Kentucky. And you do have them in town here. And it's not a real popular tree because it grows slow in the beginning and then speeds up. We have them up at SDSU, planted at the same time as ash. First 15 years, ash outgrew them. Now at 30, they're both the same size. So they do speed up in time. Does produce a pod, small pod. And that will fall to the ground and someone has to rake it up. I get it, but that's what teenagers are for. And you can buy ones that don't produce pods. They're just guy trees, but I've seen examples where there's mistakes and they still produce pods. So I just say you're going to get pods and live with it. I will say too, you can make coffee out of the beans if you roast it. The only advantage of making coffee out of those beans, if you do that and it's your weekend to make church coffee, do that once, you will never have to make coffee again. I guarantee it. It's that bad. It's why if you go to Starbucks, there is no Kentucky coffee, all right? It's that bad. So that's another one of my favorite trees. I like the hybrid elms. The accolade elm, for example, or the triumph elm, because they are of a great deal of resistance to Dutch elm disease. So those are good trees. Heritage oak is a wonderful tree. It's a cross between our bur oak and our English oak, grows fairly fast. The Ammermachia I like, kind of an unusual tree. It's about 20 feet tall. It has white flowers in the end of July. So I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And the problem is we tend to focus on one tree, maple, and just go to planting that. So, you know, look at our website, put a plug in, buy my book. Trees for the Northern Plains, that lists them all. There's a lot out there, so just dig a little deeper, go to garden centers, and don't just go to the maple row and stop. See what else is out there. Anything else? Well, all right then.
I think that's great, John. Thank you so much for coming here to us Vermilionites and taking a little time with us. We do appreciate you doing that and the work that you do here. Again, I challenge you, if you want to know more information, Google it. You'll find his name and videos, not only this one, but other videos. You'll find a lot of them out there. South Dakota Park and Rec, we pay homage to him every year. He comes to talk to the are recommended, by Dr. Ball, and he's got another great one on the, like the ginkgo and the ones that have less lineage of disease problems and stuff. On that tree guide, you won't see any maple trees on there. What are we doing? We're trying to be very active with the Emerald Ash Borer. We are taking down some trees. We're aggressively replanting trees throughout the community, a variety of species, and you didn't mention it this time, but you're saying no more than what, 8% of any one species?
Well, no, what we'd like to see, and this is even worse, no more than 5 to 10% in one genus. In other words, maples. No more than 5 to 10% of all your street trees being maples. No more than 5 to 10% of all your street trees being ash. So, because again, with emerald ash borer, it doesn't matter whether you have green ash, black ash, blue ash, pick a color, you're all going to lose them. So it doesn't matter if you say we got diversity in maples. So we're trying to be fairly hard on that. If you said your community only has about 10% maples, I'm good with that.
That's one thing that we're trying to do, again, being proactive with that one. We are working with the state of South Dakota in the agricultural department. We don't have them up yet, but as we come closer to Memorial Day, we will have 5 traps, I believe, that we put emerald ash borer traps around the community. You think maybe a kid got a kite stuck in a tree, but it's a big purple triangle thing that we hang about 20 feet in the air, is it not about feet roughly? So you'll see those around the community and such like that. We put them up, we look at them. If we have any questions, we call this guy here or some other people from the Department of Ag. We'll come take a look at them. In the past, we've had the longhorn beetle traps. We have Japanese beetle traps here in the community. We have different species of traps that we're looking for. We hope we don't find them, but we are trying to be proactive in that.
And let me give you one bit of bad news, though, is last year, a week before emerald ash borer, so it didn't get the press, is I got a sample of velvet longhorn beetle, which is from Asia, and it's occurred in 15 states, and it came from here.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to destroy all your trees, it's attacking dying walnuts, not standing healthy, but we have found it in walnuts down here. But my point is, here's an insect nowhere in the region. Where's the first place we find it? For a million. So you're not exempt.
As we did mention, we have how many, 170 acres of parks. We have all these street lines and such like that. We also have a campus that we don't control, but we have Nate here from the University of South Dakota. He does a great job. He attends our tree board meetings. We have a representative from the city that attends theirs. So we try and stay in constant contact with what we're doing there. To quickly finish up here, some of the things that we are discussing. I didn't hear probably as soundly as from you this time, but 15 miles is when you got to start getting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, just because you're so far away. But well, we don't recommend treatments until it's been detected within 15 miles of your location. Thank you.
And we're well past 15 miles here. So we are doing what we can to be proactive. What are we going to do? What are we going to do with the wood? When are you going to transport the wood? Who can cut it down? How are we going to inject? Those are all things that we are in the process of working on. We are playing copycat. Some good things come from Sioux Falls, some bad things come from Sioux Falls. But we are copying a lot of Sioux Falls. You heard Dr. Ball mention here numerous times. They're doing it right. And a lot of communities here in South Dakota are following their lead with that. And if it's, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we're trying to work with them. Our population of trees is considerably smaller, but we are allocating larger amounts of money towards our tree inventory and everything that we do, from publications to information. We have links on our city website, a couple different areas, if I'm correct here, Ryan, right, that we have links to the state of South Dakota, what to look for, what kind of trees to plant, what kind of injections. So we try and do that. The Plain Talk's been very good to try and highlight some things in what we do, and we have them represented here tonight, so I'm sure we might get a little link in the paper this week too. We are trying to be proactive. We know that we can't fight this. I mean, as far as making it stop here, we don't have an umbrella we can put over the million, but we can try and be proactive on when it does come here and what we do. So I will say again, if you do find one in your backyard, you have questions about it, you think you found it, not a cicada hopefully, but something closer to it. It's not a real big bug. I mean,
No.
I think the state has it on top of a nickel.
Yeah, about a half-inch of dust.
I mean, it's pretty small. The couple, better known tree organizations would say, Pete, the local contractors that do tree work here in the community.
Yeah, good people have contact with them.
Yeah.
They're trimming, they'll let us know.
Yeah, they're very good. So if you say again, shop local or the guys that have been around
Thank you.
Thank you guys for taking your time to come here tonight. Have a good evening.